Good afternoon and a very, very warm welcome to our event, which, as you may know, takes place within the 4th edition of Ocean Week. And it does carry a rather lovely title, Winds of Change, a nature-positive energy transition at sea. Now, our 2-hour conversation is organised by WWF and BirdLife Europe, and it is co-hosted by 2 MEPs. One of those MEPs is here on my right, Maria Soraya Rodríguez Ramos of Renew Europe, and on the panel will be MEP Jutta Paulus of the Greens. Now, why are we having this discussion? What's it all about? I've got a slightly longer introduction than I would normally give, partly because I'm picking up on the theme of yesterday's Green Week, because I had the pleasure of emceeing at Green Week. And this year's edition was called Delivering a Net Zero World, and was very, very much in the corner of this is not possible without the restoration, the protection of biodiversity of nature. It was a very, very clear message. There was a lot of conversation about it. So, of course, we've got this ambitious 2050 target. It demands a very, very rapid reduction in global emissions and the decarbonisation of human activities, including, of course, those ones which produce energy. On the other side, as you all know, we are experiencing an energy crisis because of Russia's war in Ukraine, and that crisis has spurred a drive for energy independence, energy sovereignty in Europe. So this transition from fossil fuels to renewables is even more urgent. And of course, this includes the demand for offshore wind. So member states have agreed on, as you all know, new ambitious long-term goals for the deployment of offshore renewable energy up to 2050 in each of the EU's 5 sea basins. And you've got these intermediate objectives, 2030 and 2040. And a lot of that is really building on regional cooperation instruments and tools. So here's the deal, you know all this or you wouldn't be here. Upscaling this low cost, this proven technology, it's going to take place. It is, there's a huge push. But of course, it's taking place in our oceans and seas, which are already highly degraded, very busy, very much under demand in all sorts of ways. And they're, of course, absolutely critical in the fight against climate change. So all of that leads us to the thrust of today's discussions, which really aim to underline the fact that this development of offshore wind and grid infrastructures cannot be carried out at the expense of nature. And the protection and the restoration of nature have to absolutely carry equal weight along that exploration and development of those net zero pathways. It really was a common thread yesterday. Of course, what came up time and time again yesterday was the hotly debated nature restoration law. The speaker from WWF did express, I'm choosing these words carefully, exasperation and grave concern at the actions of the EP group walkout, and actually sort of this veto of the proposal without attempting to bring a solution. Interestingly, we're going to hear we're going to touch upon that, a response from Wind Europe when we have our gentlemen on the panel. So that's a very, very long introduction to the event. Forgive me, but it's good to remind ourselves. I know that our opening speakers will elaborate on this. We've got these 2 opening speakers. We're then going to have a panel debate. You are, of course, invited to raise questions. One thing I will say is that our speaker, and you see them there from the European Commission, needs to leave at 5:30. So I will try and weave in questions for her. Our speaker from DG Energy before she needs to leave. We have a little bit longer afterwards. I know this is Brussels. I know you all have opinions and positions and all the rest. Please keep them short. Don't get on your soapboxes, not in this room. Please keep them short and to the point. A question has a question mark at the end. Okay, that's what I will say. And you can tweet at any time, #EU Ocean Week. Right. I've spoken a bit fast. Sorry to the interpreters. I've probably need a triple gin and tonic already. And I may have trodden on the toes of our first speaker. She is MEP Soraya Rodríguez Ramos, and she is going to address us in Spanish. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias y también muchísimas gracias a todos los que nos acompañan en este evento, que efectivamente, como decías, tiene un nombre muy inspirador. vientos de cambio, una transición energética positiva para la naturaleza en el mar. Es un debate muy oportuno en un momento en el que estamos debatiendo una de las, una de las leyes, no, la primera ley, porque va a ser la primera ley de restauración de la naturaleza en el Parlamento Europeo, y actividades como las energías renovables, y en este caso la energía solar, es necesario que vayan de la mano. Restaurar la naturaleza, trabajar en una transición energética que nos permita tener energías limpias, pero que a su vez, efectivamente, ambas contribuyan a una restauración necesaria de nuestros ecosistemas en la Unión Europea. Tendría que decir que el debate sobre la ley de restauración de la naturaleza está siendo tan duro en el Parlamento Europeo que hemos conseguido cosas tan extraordinarias como que aquellos diputados o grupos políticos, algunos también, que se oponen a las energías renovables, nos digan ahora en una rueda de prensa que van a votar en contra de la ley de restauración porque es un obstáculo para el desarrollo de las energías renovables. Como yo les digo a algunos, solo por esa razón deberían apoyarla, ¿no? En fin, permítanme la broma, pero quiero decir que el debate ya sobre esta ley está abandonando un poco el rigor sobre el contenido de la ley, sobre las repercusiones importantes que va a tener en muchos sectores, como por ejemplo el de las energías renovables, para acabar en una simplificación de populismo político en relación a la misma, que creo sinceramente que ante la emergencia climática que vivimos, ante la preocupación y la incertidumbre de una buena parte de la ciudadanía sobre la falta de acción política, no podemos permitirnos. La ley de restauración de la naturaleza es la segunda cara de la misma moneda de la lucha contra el cambio climático, del Green Deal. El Green Deal ha sido el programa de gobierno de esta legislatura, que finalizará el año que viene. Y ha sido y ha continuado adelante a pesar de, en fin, enormes dificultades como una pandemia mundial, una guerra en suelo europeo después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Hemos ido avanzando con el paquete de medidas que establecimos en el Green Deal para poder llegar a ser ese continente neutro en emisiones de carbono en 2050. Pero todos sabíamos que había otra moneda, es decir, tenemos que reducir emisiones, pero tenemos también que ser capaces de restaurar nuestros sumideros naturales y de restaurar todos nuestros ecosistemas que están en un grado deplorable. Esto hay que decirlo así. La urgencia de tener una ley es porque efectivamente las estrategias de protección de la naturaleza, de la biodiversidad, hasta este momento son la historia de un largo fracaso. No se han cumplido ninguno de los objetivos que de forma voluntaria los Estados se comprometieron a lograr. Por lo tanto, cuando hablamos de una ley, de la primera ley, es porque es necesario cambiar la manera de trabajar entre la Comisión y los Estados miembros, estableciendo objetivos vinculantes. Y cuando establecemos objetivos vinculantes, estamos estableciendo también una manera diferente de trabajar para hacer un monitoreo, un seguimiento y una evaluación intermedia de los objetivos que nos hemos propuesto, que no han existido hasta este momento. Y por eso, efectivamente, nos encontramos con una situación como la que hay en Europa en relación a nuestros ecosistemas terrestres, ecosistemas de agua dulce, ecosistemas marinos. Tenemos también que hacer una buena comunicación con la sociedad para que comprendan muy bien que estamos además haciendo un cambio de paradigma en la protección de la biodiversidad, que ya hemos abandonado que la ley de restauración no es una ley de protección estricta de determinados espacios, porque buenas muestras tenemos en toda Europa, en España concretamente. Yo podría hablarles ahora mismo de Doñana, por ejemplo, un área que tú puedes declarar de estricta protección, pero si no eres capaz de intervenir en las zonas que rodean ese espacio de protección, cualquier medida de protección no tiene ningún efecto. Efectivamente, si no regulas, si no estableces una manera de restaurar el entorno de Doña Ana, evitando efectivamente actividades que pueden secar los humedales, la zona estrictamente protegida queda estrictamente degradada. Por lo tanto, la ley de restauración de la naturaleza es un punto de inflexión en lo que hemos hecho hasta ahora. No establece mayores zonas de protección estricta. Podría haberlas, no las prohíbe, por supuesto. No establece una intromisión por parte de la Comisión Europea en las competencias que son competencias propias de los Estados, porque los planes nacionales de restauración son el instrumento para conseguir los objetivos de esta ley. Pero efectivamente establece objetivos a nivel europeo y establece indicadores a nivel europeo. Y les tengo que decir que todos los indicadores que establece la Comisión en esta propuesta son indicadores claramente testados, con los que ya han estado trabajando los Estados miembros, de forma voluntaria, porque esto también es muy importante. La obligación de restaurar los ecosistemas ya existía antes de esta ley. Lo que hace esta ley es introducir instrumentos diferentes para que esta vez consigamos los objetivos que nos habíamos propuesto, objetivos diferentes para medidas eficaces. Pero vamos, que no estamos haciendo una revolución, en fin, no sé, la revolución de octubre, aunque a veces me lo parece por lo que pasa en esta casa con la ley. En definitiva, es muy interesante todo lo que están aportando muchas empresas, apoyando claramente esta ley, hay que decirlo, de forma clara. Concretamente las empresas de energías renovables lo están haciendo. Y lo que acabas de expresar en relación a la necesidad de trabajar con los ecosistemas, no a expensas de los ecosistemas, es realmente el objetivo de esta ley, que no excluye ninguna actividad económica a priori, pero lo que establece es que ninguna actividad económica puede hacerse a expensas de los recursos naturales y que, por lo tanto, solamente podrá realizarse de forma compatible, que es ser sostenible, y que indudablemente tendremos que valorar económicamente cuando nos insisten tanto. Ustedes necesitan informes económicos a la hora de establecer los objetivos. Yo digo que sí, claro que sí. Pero es que hay que valorar económicamente lo que son los recursos naturales y los servicios ecosistémicos que nunca hemos tenido en cuenta en esa valoración económica. Esto es mano a mano. Las actividades sociales, la actividad social, cultural, turística, paisajística, todo ello mano con la naturaleza. Nada a costa de ella, todo con ella. Esta es tan sencilla lo que la ley de la restauración. Por eso agradezco muchísimo también el papel que estáis haciendo de apoyo a una ley que es efectivamente básica para avanzar en los objetivos del cambio climático. Sin recuperar nuestros ecosistemas, nuestros sumideros naturales, no vamos a conseguir el objetivo del Pacto Verde. No seremos un continente neutro en emisiones y, por lo tanto, este también es un valor fundamental de la Agenda Verde de la Comisión. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Very emphatic, very passionate, very clear, very factual, setting the scene and you know, yes, really sort of explaining this is why it is such a game changer. This is why it's so needed, and there is so much well, I'm paraphrasing, unnecessary fear-mongering. What made me think when you were speaking, we had Johan Rockström yesterday, the scientist who was on one of the opening panels. And one of the last things that he said was, I don't think the wider public's fear is so much of climate change as lack of leadership. And I think it was a very very nice quote. And you said there, you know, the importance of communicating with society because there is less understanding of this nexus between the fight against climate change and biodiversity. But when we have these debates that become very heated, it's also challenging eventually for the public to have that understanding. And there was a poll yesterday that we ran that asked, you know, what's your feeling about the biodiversity climate nexus? And the main issue that came out that our audience voted on is we don't think that the wider public understands quite what's at stake. So these kind of wrangles, they're challenging too, challenging for the wider public. Thank you very much. I don't know how long you are staying with us. I'm going to, are you staying for a while? Okay, fantastic. So I think you had a report out recently that you're going to unpack. Are you going to talk a little bit? You're going to talk, so the director of WWF, the European office, this journey from nature protection to nature positive, because that nature positive element is going to come up a lot. You've had a report just come out, is that correct? Or series
many
of reports?
series of reports. But first, quería continuar en español antes de pasar al inglés para agradecerte, Soraya, el compromiso durante muchos años desde tu mandato para pues, cumplir los objetivos del Pacto Verde Europeo y especialmente en estos momentos con la Ley de Restauración de la Naturaleza y otras que van a venir. National Restoration Plans that you mentioned as well, Soraya, are coordinated with the strategies of the deployment of renewables energy, including offshore wind. We know that that and many other aspects of the law are currently at stake. The third point is about establishing frameworks for regional cooperation, both between member states, EU and non-EU countries, to ensure that the cumulative effects of the deployment of offshore wind infrastructures are accounted for, and then we can also monitor at regional level. And my last point is about the tendering of the projects, something that we've already mentioned, ensuring that, and there are already good examples, that we shift away from being mainly based on price and more towards a broad framework that gives also priority to environmental and social. I think that's really important, social criteria. Just to conclude, with WWF, we firmly believe that the question of nature or climate is not the one of either or. We really need to both. And I'll say again that nature is our climate secret ally. And we are advocating for a massive expansion of the deployment of renewables, especially wind and solar. And we believe that that can be done in a nature-friendly way. And I would like to conclude thanking my colleagues and the colleagues of BirdLife and thanking Soraya and Jutta as well for hosting us today and for all the support that we are getting to make sure that we get this transition right again for nature and for people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I had the opportunity to meet the speakers who are going to come onto the panel before, so I can happily say that all of these issues that you have spoken about, what is particularly important, the non-price criteria, this regional cooperation, certainly the participatory management, which I'm still, hey, I'm not working in the domains, you're still amazed somehow. It's just not a bloody given anywhere. It always amazes me that we have to keep saying, but we all need to sit down and talk. I don't know. And designing, well, I know that there is that's a sensitive one, isn't it? The projects outside the MPAs, that's another very sensitive conversation, is it not? So I'm sure that's going to crop up in some capacity. Thank you so much, ladies, for so amply setting the scene.
Thank you.
And onwards and upwards, as we say, we're going to do a nice little, thank you. We're going to do a nice little musical chairs. That's what we're going to do. So, wow. There you are. God, finally, this man, this delightful speaker, Ewout van Galen, has literally told me how to pronounce his name 65 billion times, and that's the first time I've got it right. Please come and join me here. I'm just going to put this one up. here, if you may, a wout. Here, now I'm making a big feature of it, aren't I? A wout. So I will introduce you all momentarily, if you can please join. Here, please, our MEP. So delightful to meet you. Thank you very much, Jutta Paulus. And also, can we have from Mattia Cecchinato, Senior Advisor for Offshore Wind at Wind Europe. A very, very warm welcome. You could give them a nice round of applause because it makes them feel. All right. Can I just say a couple of words about you so that when they want to orient their questions, they know to whom they are orienting their questions. So I think probably people know a fair bit about you because they're much more knowledgeable. Look at you, you're sort of doing it, do they really? You're a member of the Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety and a substitute for the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, and also a pharmacist, I read. Is that right? I'm always fascinated by people's pasts, absolutely fascinated. So Ewout is the head of programs at North Sea Foundation. What I particularly liked on the website of the North Sea Foundation is it says, for more than 4 decades, the organisation has been standing up for the North Sea. I thought that was such a delightful phrase, standing up to ensure its protection and sustainable use. So you have a tremendous amount of hats that you wear, you know, looking at all the different kind of human pressures, fisheries, sand extraction, the shipping, the beach litter. And interestingly, AWAT's current focus is on the rollout of marine protected areas in the Dutch North Sea. Now, that Dutch North Sea agreement was quite recent, June 2020. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. So that's between central government stakeholders, trying to really see what's that balance between what you want to achieve and the policies and that management, those conversations. Katharina here. I don't think I'm going to pronounce your surname correctly. I would ask you to do it yourself, please.
Sikov-Mani.
Thank you very much. Sikov-Mani. Katharina Sikov-Mani is the director responsible for the green transition and energy system integration at DG Energy. And really, you've also worn lots of hats because previously you were working as head of unit in charge of consumers, local initiatives and the just transition, which I think is very useful for this conversation. And prior to that, head of unit for networks and regional initiatives. Again, very useful for our conversation. Mattia Cecchinato from Wind Europe. You know that this is really the voice of the wind energy industry, but across the entire value chain, correct? So you've got a lot of different voices in there, the manufacturers, the component suppliers, the power utilities, the wind farm developers, and you're looking at all sorts of areas, including the offshore wind regulation, the offshore and onshore grid planning, and all of those different users of the sector. So some very clever people here. I've spoken enough. What I'm going to do is we're going to have a few questions. I'm going to chat with them and then I'm going to take some questions, being mindful of when you have to go. Again, remember, keep them beautifully short and sweet. I'm going to come straight in with you, if I may, particularly on the public participation aspect, because I'm fascinated by it. Public participation, stakeholder participation, we've heard it's absolutely critical. Every time I moderate, I say to people, but how? We have these big political statements, we must collaborate better. But how do we do it in this particular case? What's not there in place? What needs to be in place?
Yes, thank you very much for the question, and thank you a lot for organizing this event. I think it is really timely given the pressure that this legislative proposal is under. And we have made sure in our amendments and also in the compromises that we do want a proper public involvement, proper participation of the local communities who will be most affected by the restoration plans that member states will put in place. So we have demanded from member states to set up a process where everyone has his or her say and to make sure that it is inclusive so that not only the loudest ones will be heard, but also the ones that may not even dare to speak up when there are other loudspeakers around. And I'll tell you a little story about my home country, Germany. You may have heard the name of Robert Habeck, who is now our Minister for Economy and the Climate. And he used to be the Minister for Energy, Agriculture, Environment, and something else, Coast, when at the regional level in the constituency of Schleswig-Holstein. Now, Schleswig-Holstein is right south of Denmark, and they have a lot of wind energy. And a lot of wind energy was being built, and they ran into the problem that the electricity could not be transported to the south because the grid was not properly sufficient. Exactly. And so instead of using the normal procedure where the authorities come up with a plan and then it's laid open and then people can make their Eingaben so that you can give your opinion and certain stakeholders have to be heard and then it goes into the legal procedure and then it gets legally challenged and it takes years and years and years. He did a different approach. He and the Secretary of State spent a whole year traveling the whole constituency, coming to the people saying, hey, are we all on the same page when it comes to we want to profit from our wind energy? We want to profit from the electricity that our constituency produces and that we can sell to the south. Are we all on the same page here? Great. Then now we have to decide how to transport this energy. We have thought we might go this way or that way or that way, and we would like to hear your views. So they collected the views of the constituency. I don't know how many local town halls they have visited in that time, and they made the plans after speaking to the people, after involving everyone. And listen, they didn't get one single court case. They didn't get one single legal challenge. And at the end of the day, the slow approach was quicker than the fast approach because people were on board and people said, yeah, he has spoken to us, he has listened to us, and okay, we understand it's not so nice for us because we have to look at those power lines. But if the other route would have been chosen, there would have been 3 times as much people affected. So if you involve people at an early stage, if you take everyone on board, your chances of achieving a good result are much, much better.
Thank you very much. And so let me turn to you, Ewout, and ask, I mean, picking up from that, for just your opening thoughts from what you've heard from WWF and, you know, picking again up on this issue of speed. We've got those huge targets, this absolute drive behind, offshore wind, but at what cost? So what do you want to say in response to what you've heard thus far? If you lay out your stall for our audience. Thank you.
I want to say many, many things. Speed is exactly what we need. The rollout of offshore energy this has to happen now. Now it has to happen yesterday in the face of the climate crisis, but also to become energy independent. The restoration law needs to pass. This is what I want to say. It is so important, again, with speed. It's a matter of urgency. When I look at my home country, the Netherlands, we score bright red on practically all descriptors under the Marine Policy Framework Directive. There's loss of habitat. There is declining bird species. Larger fish species like rays and sharks are not doing well. There's heavy pollution even in the Dutch part of the North Sea. Nature needs the restoration law in order to recover. However, nature is not the only entity that needs this law. Business wants this law. Go on, actually yesterday I read that about 1,400 companies worth $5 trillion have said that they want their governments to adopt regulations to actually reverse the damage that's been done to the environment. So there's been so much unnecessary scaremongering around the restoration law. While I say, no, nature needs it, business wants it. When I talk about business, I'd like to, if you allow me, single out 2 sectors. Fisheries. Fisheries. Such a sensitive sector again, eh? We need the restoration law in order to have healthy fish stocks. We need marine protected areas that can serve as spawning areas, for example, or migrating fish. It's very important. They actually represent an economic value. Besides fisheries, another nice industrial sector is the offshore wind energy. You know, they need the restoration law. Why? Because the main result of the restoration law is that at least 20% of Europe's sea is going to recover from heavy damage done by intensive bottom trawling, for example. If this is not recovered, offshore wind will not find the ecological space that's actually needed for wind farms to be rolled out. That means that based on existing conservation laws, this rollout will be frustrated. One of our speakers before prior has also said that nature and climate need to come together. And I think that is my main point. We can later on discuss on how I feel this need to come together, but I want to end by saying we need more marine protected areas. We need more research into the cumulative effects of wind parks, also in relation to other industrial activities on the North Sea. We need restoration activities within wind parks, but also outside. And last but not least, I would definitely like to urge all European member states to finally start adopting non-price criteria in the auction design for offshore tenders, because those non-price criteria in the Netherlands, we have quite some experience on this, but they are about biodiversity, they are about sustainability, about supply chain management, and also to some extent for social economic benefits.
Thank you. And we will definitely come back to that. That is definitely going to be something that I know that you want to comment on further, and others. Can I just say, I loved it when you said such a sensitive sector. You just needed a cat, because you've got a roll neck, you needed a cat like a Bond villain to such a sensitive sector. I loved it. Anyway, so thank you for that moment of entertainment and for your very clear words there. So you've said, very much where it is needed for the fisheries sector. You've also said it's absolutely needed so that, these operators, they have sufficient, you said, ecological space for the rollout of the wind farms. Well, let's hear about that. If I may turn to you, Mattia, let me invite you in 3 or 4 minutes to lay out your stall and perhaps indeed respond to what you've heard thus far. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Many thanks, Katrina. Well, many thanks to BirdLife and colleague for the invitation. Well, maybe just allow me to frame very quickly the offshore wind sector. Today, we do have 30 gigawatt installed in European waters. This includes the UK. They span across 13 countries, but 80% of the installations today are in the North Sea, where most of the activities are and where we actually expect they will remain. Offshore wind today is cost effective. It can also happen merchant, and that's also thanks to the technological development happen in these countries and not only. The political ambition today is huge. If we put together the government ambitions, we reach more than 150 gigawatt by 2030 compared to the 30 we have today. This is a 5-time increase. The industry today, again, has reached a very good status, is mature, is well established, especially the bottom fixed sector, but is facing many challenges. It's facing challenges in regards of certainty of realization in terms of attracting investment certainty, how to upscale the supply chain to actually bring the operation to be 5 times what we are doing today. And of course, also we're thinking more and more on our effects on biodiversity. How can we minimize the negative effects that the building turbines at sea will bring, and how we can enhance those positive effects that are being observed by the first long-term monitoring programs, and we really want to put our effort on. Now, there is one single solution to solve all this, and it's proper auction design. It's been mentioned already. Proper auction design can help giving investors certainty. For example, governments can provide a long timeline of projects, so not going only to the next tenders, but give us visibility well beyond. The supply chain can have the security to invest to upgrade their infrastructure. Tender design can help and speed up permitting, but maybe the most important thing, tender design, when well done, can evaluate projects based on the extra value that they bring to the society. These are the non-price criteria. So this is a new way, relatively new way since 2021. Only the Netherlands is the most established now. It's really a new way to evaluate projects that goes beyond price only. Price is there. We managed to bring it down. What can we do to enhance all those other societal values, system integration, innovation, citizens inclusion, and of course, sustainability, biodiversity, and ecology? We strongly support the non-price criteria. The industry loves to compete, and they love to compete on other things than price. And we really believe that this is the way beyond. And this is also the way beyond to having restoration measures, protection measures, widely applied within wind farms, because governments with these non-price criteria have control of what can, should happen within wind farms, at least giving some general guidelines, and then let the industry propose what could be the best. And our members, regardless of the non-price criteria, are already working with NGOs to actually apply restoration measures. Today, we're still at pilot, but I think it's a very important sign that we are working on it, and we're really ready to upscale and have this commonly applied within wind farms. And that's the reason why we support the restoration law. We can contribute to it. We want to be part of it, and that's why also the statement that you mentioned yesterday, we went publicly to support the effort of the European Parliament in defending and protecting the restoration law, and we hope they're going to be positive for this.
And as I understand it, you went further because, I mean, you used the word yourself, scaremongering. You said enough of the scaremongering. I mean, you went further by sort of really being very blunt and saying, you know, to the EPP, please don't use industry as the scapegoat for not achieving it. Now, I'm well aware that you have many different members. I'm not for a moment suggesting that all your members are necessarily all aligned, but you did take that step. And that's, I think, a very useful, very helpful step. Is it an unusual step for you to take?
Well, I think it's very important to give a sign of where the industry wants to go and the impact that we want to have. Again, we want to increase our environmental performance, and we want to support the restoration targets. And that's also to recognize that work that we, as Wind Europe, and some of our members are, for example, doing with the NGOs. We do have the Offshore Coalition for Energy and Nature, led and coordinated by RTI, there where we meet very often to talk, share positions, and try to really think about those next steps that industry and environmental parties must take together in order to make all this happen.
We will come back to that. Let me just very much want to hear from you. There's a kind of a missing piece in the puzzle here. So let me give you an opportunity, quite nice, I think, to speak last, because you do get to listen to everybody else and take it into account. But what do you want to say as an opening gambit, please? Thank you.
Many thanks, and many thanks for having me here in this very topical and timely event. So looking at things from energy point of view, so let me start by stressing that offshore renewables are indispensable for the energy transition, for affordable energy prices, for regional and European secure supply, lowering our dependency on Russian fossil fuels, and also, obviously, for the environment. I would say that offshore renewables is not a luxury product that we can choose whether we want it or not. But on the contrary, it's a fundamental pillar of what we highly need to tackle today's challenges. We don't have enough space on land to do onshore wind, but we still do have ample space offshore. In today's complex geopolitical situation, offshore renewables need to be a story of success and European unity. Heads of state and government of the North and Baltic Seas have been clear in this direction. Offshore renewables are a strategic political priority. We need to then make sure that we also look into the other sea basins that we have in the EU, where it is technically obviously more complex than it is in the shallow waters of the North and Baltic Seas. So it's not a question of choosing between alternatives, but let's not forget that the biggest risk to biodiversity will also be not deploying enough renewables to get out from fossils. So it is not the question if we need offshore renewables, but how we develop them. So I think what we do have, and it's not an easy piece of puzzle, we have a climate crisis, we have a nature crisis, and on top of that, we have a challenge called security of supply. We cannot afford to disregard any of these three elements I mentioned. But what makes it even more complex is that our citizens and businesses expect to have electricity at affordable prices. So all this put together makes it quite a challenging thing than bringing all the actors, be they people building infrastructure projects or people living in the area or the fisheries that were mentioned, and in particular the citizens that are concerned by a sustainable future that we all want to see. So that's, I think, what I would want to say as a way of introduction. A lot of work ahead of us, very challenging work of us, and we can only succeed by working together between EU member states, between stakeholders, between citizen groups, and all of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask a bit of a provocative question before I move on to our MEP? Nicely provocative question. Very, very good very good statement. Yes, you're absolutely right. In the geopolitical, the energy context, it absolutely does have to be a success story. Those were your words. Sometimes the Commission has come, under fire for coherence across directorates general, across policy areas. Do you feel confident that what DG Energy, that vision, that strategy, those policies are very much in line with DG Energy, with DG Klima, that it is joined up in order to make sure that this accelerated rollout can respect and protect nature?
We certainly, thanks for the question, a very important one. We do our best efforts in order to make sure that all the different pieces of legislation that come out from the Commission and then that are debated by the European Parliament and the Council are coherent in their implementation, take into account not only where we want to go, but also the different starting points in different member states. So we do have a number of pieces of legislation, not only the ones we've discussed already here today, but Renewables Energy Directive, Marine Strategy Framework Directive, Birds and Habitats Directives, and for infrastructure, Trans-European Network infrastructure. All these pieces look at the objective that we need to achieve, so addressing the crisis that I referred to from different angles, and we need to bring them together. So we cannot only work on infrastructure, we cannot only work on nature, but we need to look at all of them together. So here, I would say that the responses that we receive from stakeholders on the one hand, on what we put on the table for co-legislators is very important, because it's also then people who work on the ground who can signal to us whether things work as we have intended them to work. So that's one thing. Then the other thing is, of course, implementation. I think you did not ask this question directly, but I think it is very important that we implement what we have as it is intended to be implemented. And that does not always perhaps happen as fast as we can. So I'm very confident that we do have this coherence that allows us to address the different crises in the best balanced way that we need. But it's not easy.
Thank you. Hold your thoughts for any questions. I will give you an opportunity if you have specific questions for the Commission, because, as I said, you will need to leave earlier. But just dans le désordre, I wanted to ask a question about, it's very important, when we say, there's lots of naysayers, there's lots of voices, there's lots of fears. You talked about the fisheries sector, very sensitive, but one has to address those concerns. I'm going to come to that in a minute, because I'm going to try and keep things a bit coherent. I'm just going to give you the opportunity, if there's anything from hearing what your colleagues have said, just to expound for a couple of minutes, push the debate forward. And then, again, for the sake of coherence, I'd like to pick up on the non-price criteria. If there was something that Mattia left out of there, I think you wanted to come back on that. But what would you like to say, Jutta?
Yes, I really just wanted to stress that the twin crisis of biodiversity loss and climate change cannot be solved if we only look at one of the two sides, because they both reinforce each other. And also the IPCC synthesis report, which was published this year, was very, very clear that we cannot reach our climate targets if we do not restore degraded ecosystems. And so I find it very worrying when some political groups claim that nature restoration would stand in the way of the rollout of renewables, because we have just heard from the sector that this is not the case. And we have a multitude of statements, if I may say so. We have this Euroelectric, the Nature Conservancy proposal, where also the sector actually says we are ready to take responsibility. We are also ready to help with financing, and we do want to have the synergies between those two objectives really really also secured in legislation, which is what we try to do in our compromises in the ENVI committee. So I think that is something where I would like to have everyone become very, very vocal and say, this is not economy against nature. This is economy saying, let's preserve nature, let's restore nature so that we will have an economy in future. And that's something where before we get back to the fishers, we also would, or I also would like to have a more, let's say, realistic debate on the actual scientific findings that we have when it comes to fishing. Because we heard not very long back that it were a blatant lie, that our fish stocks were in decline, that this was not the truth. I'm like, okay, so we're living on different planets. But it was actually someone this morning at the Nature Restoration Law breakfast, which my colleague Sirpa Pietikainen had been organizing, where Copa Cogeca and also what is the counterpart in fisheries? I always took Europesh. Europesh claimed, no, we don't have a problem with fish stocks. Fish stocks are not declining. I'm like, okay, then I have different numbers than you. And I fear that ignoring a problem does not make the problem go away. We should all be older than 2 years old saying, you don't see me. That won't bring us anywhere.
But the extension from that, and then I promise I will come to you, the extension from that, of course, is that yesterday at Green Week, when we hear about, okay, huge change of mindset, you cannot set off for another shore unless you are prepared to leave the one behind. The huge change of mindset for this green transition can only take place unless you really do focus on that shore and you're prepared to leave the existing economic model behind. And to do that, of course, it requires everybody. And the issue that I have when we have things being said like there is no problem with fish stocks, the public does not know what the hell to think at the end of the day. The public is being asked, be on board, come along, but the confusion indeed around the messaging, and it comes back to what I said, are we more scared of climate change or the leadership, the lack of leadership? But let's come back again to that. You wanted to talk, we heard there from Mattia, he said, listen, governments can contribute, you said, to really proper ocean design. Non-price criteria can really include restoration measures. They are very important in the way forward. You are very much in that camp, I think.
Very much. And now I will try to talk about non-price criteria, but then through the lens of coherence, because I really liked what you said about coherence. And what I'm trying to say is that non-price criteria, they actually support the intended results of the restoration law on a massive scale, yeah? But the issue of coherence with other sectors is very important. The offshore wind is actually the new kid on the block, especially on the North Sea. They're held to, at least in the Netherlands, to high ecological standards. We have two experiences now, two tenders that have a majority percentage of non-price criteria. That's the part that I'm very proud of. I'm not very proud of the Netherlands when it comes to their viewpoint on the restoration law. So that's not coherent. What I'm also not very proud of is that at one point, I have to say also to the wind industry, we need your support. Why? Because if you say that you want to be nature positive by 2030, and you say, yes, we need non-price criteria in the auction and in the tender design, then explain to me, how is it possible that there are still countries that are allowing bottom trawling within wind parks? How are we to have non-price criteria in auction design? How are we actually supposed to restore the areas in wind parks under the results of the restoration law for it to be destroyed by bottom trawling? And I'm not saying quit bottom trawling altogether, because I think we need to take the concerns of the fisheries very, very seriously. So we need to look at alternative livelihoods as well. But there are possibilities. So there are possibilities for passive fisheries, for example, in wind parks. I'm just saying, look at it through the lens of coherence, because otherwise you destroy your own capital.
But looking through the lens of coherence, again, requires all of those stakeholders to be around the table at the outset throughout the process, does it not? Otherwise, that's very, very hard to achieve.
Well, and then I come back, if you allow me. Like the Dutch example, when it comes to governance involving all stakeholders, I very much like, because we've got the Dutch North Sea Agreement, where government is represented, the developers are represented, fisheries, science, shipping, etc. So we have one table, we get together every month, and we talk about these issues. And we talk about how to actually govern the scarce sea that we have.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Mattia, because you were scribbling in with a very nice ink pen, I might say. That is rare for me to see. Mine is a crappy bit. Look, very nice ink pen. So I think you may want to say something there, but also because you mentioned those words again, nature positive, I want to just also pull that out, because I know some of your members have made this commitment to nature positive. It would be helpful, I think, perhaps people think about nature positive in a different way in the room, but it would be interesting to understand from you what that is in practice.
Sure. Maybe I first reply to Eva. And yeah, you're right, clearly. Unluckily, it's not up to the wind industry to decide what can happen within their perimeters. That's up to government. But I think you touched a very important point, which is like, I mean, being nature positive is not a matter of a single wind farm, because even if there are no trawlers within the wind farm with restoration areas, but they are all around and in all the sea, does it really make sense to think about one single wind farm as nature positive? That must be a collective effort. And of course, the wind industry can contribute from their side, also with what I was mentioning before. From our perspective, if now we look for a second, just a single wind farm being nature positive means absolutely minimize as much as possible all the negative impacts that could provoke even more habitat loss or other negative effects on the environment. Once these are dealt, there must be the focus on.
So if every member state does their own wind farms and connects that onshore domestically, we will have thousands of kilometers of unnecessary cables instead of cooperating. So, and then cost would be obviously very high. So there are synergies, win-win situations in this respect. So we from the Commission side, we have been promoting what we call regional cooperation already for more than a decade. The first instances were, to make sure that the 3 Baltic states, for instance, get their grid connected to the rest of the EU and not to the Soviet Union or today Russia and Belarus. So, but that's where it started. And now regional cooperation has extended from that very narrow starting point in the Baltics to different parts of the EU. We are most advanced in the Baltic Sea area and then Northern Seas area, where the work on the development of the offshore grid and sea basin development is already very well advanced. So here it is the Commission, member states, but also project promoters, environmental organizations, and different other type of stakeholders come together to look at what is the potential, what we can do, what are the challenges and obstacles, so what do we need to address, and then how can we do it together to be most save money in terms of the kilometers of cables, and share resources which are scarce, and then the maritime spatial plans is obviously a very good tool to do this together. But it's not only the planning side. It's also very useful to work together on the analytical side, so understanding of the data, bringing data together through studies and research. Already 6-7 years ago, we did a first strategic environmental impact assessment in the Northern Seas together, because the law requires that to be done per member state, but we did it together across all the Northern Seas countries. So there are many ways one can do it, starting by working together to develop the common understanding, through then bringing the science into the discussion. And last year, for instance, just to give you one example, under the EU research program, Horizon Europe, we had a call on wind energy in the natural and social environment as a research topic. So the aim is really to build the knowledge base in getting the questions of cumulative impact, social engagement, and coexistence of sectors to have really more information. And then the last point here I wanted to mention is also regional cooperation, extremely important to share good practices, share perhaps bad practices from what to learn from between member states. And that goes beyond one sea basin, so Northern Sea countries can easily bring also good and practices to be avoided to the other sea areas. And this is what we also do on a regular basis through our regional group work streams.
Thank you. And you sort of chuckled at that as well in reckoning. I would agree with that. You're not the first person to say in a recent event I've moderated the utter importance. In fact, it was a moderation on the EU ocean mission. And exactly that was this point. Christ, we need to share more bad practices. We need to stop repeating things. And I always think that's surely one of the beauties of Europe, is this ability to look outside and sort of go, okay, that doesn't quite work, but I could use a bit of that. And that doesn't, to adopt and to replicate, and sharing bad practice or things that don't work is also, or things that perhaps might work if they were, approached a little differently. Okay, I'm just going to take a read of the room, being mindful of the time for also you. I don't want to take questions for everybody quite yet, because I just want to give these good people a chance. There's a couple of other things I'd like to ask. But is there any thus far questions specifically for Katharina? Or are you happy to be in listening mode a little bit longer? Are you okay? You know there's water outside if you need it. Okay? All right. Okay. Are you learning stuff thus far? Yes, I am. They're good speakers, aren't they? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to come back to you, if I may, Jutta, and really just dig in a bit more. We had, first of all, you said fisheries such a sensitive sector, and then you actually acknowledged, we need to be, that there are conversations that really, really have to be had. There are sectors, fisheries, that are going to be affected by this development of offshore wind and, the impact on marine ecosystems. So how can we ensure this just transition? What kind of conversations do we need to be having? And how can we kind of unlock the friction, the tricky stuff?
I think, first of all, we should try to agree on the same facts, because that is often an obstacle, as I mentioned before, when one side says we have no problem with fish stock, they're not declining, and the other side says, well, our data says otherwise, then we have a problem agreeing on anything because we don't have the same presumptions. So I think, first of all, we have to, in any conversation, we have to have this stock take. are we all on the same page when it comes to the future of the sector? When it also, I mean, all events I have participated in with the fishing sector, there was always a big concern that there are so many old people working in the sector and so few young people working in the sector. So at the end of the day, we should maybe look at, okay, how many fish can we actually sustainably take from the ocean in order for the younger fishermen to have something to fish in 10 years' time? And then maybe we do need a transformation plan, just in the same fashion as it has been done, for example, in my country when it comes to the coal sector, as it has been done in Poland when it comes to the coal sector, where there were, of course, there were a lot of emotions in the room, but you do not need emotions to do the math, to look at, okay, how many people do we have working in the sector which have surpassed the 60th year of age? How many do we have that are 50 years old today? How many do we have that are 40 years old today? So that you can actually look, okay, who is going to be affected? What is a way for the ones that are affected and they say, I do not see a future for me in my profession today? What other options do we have for them? I mean, I was in Iceland, it was 20 years ago. Yeah, it was 20 years ago, actually. Wow. And there were former whaling boats that were now taking tourists for whale watching. And actually they said, we make more profit today than we ever made from harpooning the whales. Of course, we cannot have every fisherman taking tourists out in his boat to watch herring or something. That's for sure.
Yeah, he just said, what's wrong with herring?
Nothing's wrong with herring.
Okay, let's just do a poll of the room. Who would rather go and watch herring than whales? You're being a bit provocative. Okay, I
Yes,
apologize.
but I think what's also important, let's try to develop solutions together. Let's try to develop solutions involving people. That was my point before. Let's ask them, what kind of ideas do you have? Because let's assume the fishing stock collapses. Let's just assume it. Then what would be your idea for a transition of the sector? Apart from, of course, we will need money for that, we will need compensation. But let's just assume this were the case. What would be your idea for your town, for your fishers, for the fishing boats, for the boat industry, which are all together in this? And that is, I think, the way forward.
So that would be, let's just assume, because you're not starting from the same page, because there is a big point being made that fish stocks aren't at risk, and there you said, and that's your kind of way in. I like that. That's if people do still tweet, maybe you're all Instagrammers, I don't know, but if you are tweeting at hashtag EU Ocean Week, that's a nice quote. You don't need emotions to do the maths. That's a good quote. So that brings me very nicely to a question for you, if I may. I'm mindful of the time, is the role of NGOs in supporting the renewable energy transition, how you're sitting there, you know, with industry, and also just picking up on this point. You seem to be very proud of the North Sea Agreement. You said you meet once a month, the stakeholders. You're having these conversations. I'm interested to know what you think of that suggestion to, you know, unlock tricky conversations, and what's the role of the NGO alongside industry and alongside government?
I like what you said, and because you said let's invite this sector to come up with their ideas, and I think that's actually relatively new, because for years we have been thinking for certain sectors. So we have been saying, like, okay, this could be an alternative livelihood for fishermen. And I have to say, I refrain from this now, because also let the facts speak. I think it's important to talk about alternative livelihoods and to take those concerns also seriously. But on the other hand, in the Dutch North Sea, fisheries has access to about 80% of the sea. Now, give me a sector that has such a high percentage of access to the sea. So, I mean, it's actually a very good position for them. Let me also remind everybody that fisheries is very heavy, at least in the Netherlands, in Natura 2000 areas. So we have the Wadden Sea. It's a particularly sensitive sea area. It's a very, very ecologically valuable area, and it has the most dubious honor to be one of the most bottom-trawled and terribly governed area in the European Union. So let those facts also speak. And for the rest, I like what you said, because fishermen are also entrepreneurs, so they're also responsible for their own business model.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anything just before I move? Because I just want to pick up this issue of you know, the actual area in allocation of offshore wind and the challenges there because of the amount of sectors that, well, we're talking about fisheries here, but there are many others that have impacts. How can we make sure that all of this is addressed in the spatial planning, that there's adequate spatial management, there's really that planned approach?
Well, I think what was talking before is the key. Everybody must sit in the table. Everybody must be able to provide their requirements, and ideally everybody should also be able to have something to let go. I mean, that's the compromise, the coexistence. It's also in some cases accepting not ideal condition and indeed compromise. Talking specifically about fishermen, we do believe we might also have a role as the wind industry to help the sector to transition to more sustainable fishing technique. Those techniques are definitely more compatible with offshore wind farms. They can happen much easily. There is a big risk of safety, let's say, which I learned is the most important thing at sea. It's more important than nature, it's more important than offshore wind. The first concern is always safety. But we do want to do our part, and that's why the wind industry is very open to investigate options to accommodate other sector interests within our wind farm. We talked about restoration measures, for example. We talked about, I just mentioned the sustainable fishing techniques, but we're also working for the navies. They can place radars in the substations, for example. They can do joint training and operation. We talk about tourism. They can come and visit the wind farms, of course, respecting the safety regulations. But indeed, what also Eva was mentioning, we are the last sector arrived at sea. I don't believe we're still the kid of the block. I think we are reaching maturity, really, like grown men. But it's of course in our moral duty to be open and try to boost as much as possible coexistence with other sectors so that they will not lose space, so to minimize the negative effects that we can bring in some cases to other sectors.
I have a question to come back to you, but I want to come to Catherine because I'm just aware of the time. And I know, you know, it's a sensitive one, but it would be interesting to hear, because we heard in the opening from WWF the issue about, you know, really keeping those marine protected areas out of this. I know that there are different viewpoints on this from industry, that there is a possibility. You know, we talked about this, we touched upon this a little bit before this event in terms of, you know, the rollout of offshore wind in those areas. It has to be done in a very particular way. I'd be quite interested for you to voice that. I think it's helpful and interesting, but we have raised eyebrows from the MEP on our right. But can I just come back to Katharina? In all of this, there is always this keeping the environmental, the social, and the economic hand in hand, and you know that is also partly within your vision, within your strategy. So is there anything specific you think that needs to happen in order for that to be honoured, that sort of triplets, let's call it that, the triplets?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I would say that in order to keep these different elements together, first, we need, and I like very much what Jutta Paulus said on having the facts right. So having the common understanding of what are we talking about when we speak about the different elements, be it environment or energy, etc. So let's collect the facts, build the understanding, but also build the understanding from the perspective of the different parties that are there discussing, debating, maybe opposing to developments in the sea area. Because we need to also understand where they come from, what are their concerns. And sometimes the concerns are perhaps not the ones that we are really discussing, and we can find solutions then easily there. But then the last element is that we are speaking about elements where there are we have different objectives, and inevitably we cannot always at every moment meet all of them at the same time. So we may need to discuss trade-offs, not general trade-offs by saying that environment is always more important than having one more wind park, but saying that, okay, in this particular situation, because of the vulnerability or other things, we need strict protection and we do nothing there. But then on another area, maybe we need to say that, but as we do need these offshore wind projects or offshore ocean projects, maybe here we need to really see how we implement it. Maybe we do it a little bit more in an industrial scale than we would want to in order to spare the other parts. So really looking at then from the different perspectives of what could be the trade-offs there.
And just a last question from me. Oh, well, actually, no, that's very rude. Does anybody else on the panel have a question or a comment for Katharina?
Yeah,
yes, go ahead. Thank you.
What I've learned over the years for the case of the Dutch North Sea is that everything comes together at the Dutch North Sea. There's very little space. It's one of the highest productive seas in the world, but everyone wants something from it. We have a food transition going on, we have an energy transition going on, and a nature transition. And that nature transition is actually lagging behind compared to the other transitions. So, we know how fast the developments go in offshore wind. And as opposed, we also know, and maybe that's the elephant in the room, but how terribly slow the process around creating marine protected areas is going. Let me give you an example. In the Netherlands, we've literally worked on establishing marine protected areas for 120 years. About 1.5 years ago, we had 0.3% of strictly protected areas. Since last year, we are at 5%, and we have an ambition of 15%. Now, I find that very alarming, knowing that when we talk about the restoration law as well, knowing what the role of marine protected areas is as a carbon sink, because it stores carbon, to restore the environment generally, but also to make the sea more robust in the light of this ongoing industrialization. And I find it sort of an elephant in the room when you talk about balancing all these human activities. We cannot manage ecosystems, but we can manage human activities.
Over to you, Matthew.
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely makes sense. The two must go together. You asked me a quite delicate question. I'll try to reply as impartially as I can. In general, we can say the industry doesn't want to build when there are significant effects. When there are significant effects on the environment, when there are significant effects on defense capability of a country, when there are, in general, when it will become too much bearable as the negative impact that we have. But at the same time, we also struggle, let's say, to support anything that excludes area a priori without the site-specific assessment. And the only way to have a site-specific assessment is to conduct an environmental impact assessment in case of projects in normal areas, or appropriate assessment in case the project will be inside maritime protected areas. And we believe that in certain cases, in certain protected areas, we could build a wind farm with no significant effects. And in those cases, we believe we can even coexist with maritime protected areas. This is, I repeat, is very much site-specific. That cannot be generalized. But I also repeat one last mention, is the only way to know it is really a right to do the site-specific impact assessment.
Yes. Before she leaves, wants to. Yes.
Thank you, Mattia. And you mentioned the environmental impact assessment. And Katharina, you also mentioned the strategic environmental impact assessment. as commendable as that is, I'm also a bit critical because the instrument of an environmental impact assessment is inherently conservative. It looks at minimizing the damage. But we need more than minimizing damage. We need to offset. We need to do something extra. Isn't that the whole idea also of the restoration law? So don't be too happy with, you know, all those environmental impact assessments because they are conservative.
Yes, but actually you need to find out what is the impact in order to say what should the industry or whoever has the impact do as compensation. So you need to sort of measure the impact in order to find out what would be a good compensation measure.
I'm picking up on the sense that the thrust of yours was you're worried that people might sort of tick boxes and feel that's kind of enough, and there's that
and they
sense.
don't do the extra mile.
Right. Catherine, I think that just for you now, because I know you have to slip away and I know you have a meeting with the Commissioner, what did you not get to say or respond to?
Thanks. No, I don't think I have anything I want to add. I think it has been very stimulating discussion and super interesting, and certainly need to look more into this also from our perspective and make sure that we engage. I mean, I mentioned we bring all the parties together in our regional groups, but maybe we need to engage more at an earlier stage, as you mentioned, that not only when the impacts start happening, but already before, so that we can see. I mean, I do like the strategic environmental assessment, but maybe we need to have something even, more strategic that looks at the different sectors, different uses, and not only looks at how we produce energy in a strategic way. So I think I leave it here, and many thanks, and sorry I have to leave.
Thank you very much. Can we please give warm thanks to... Thank you very much. Any questions at this juncture? You've all been very good students, listening well, I hope. We've sufficiently entertained and stimulated you. Are you happy to hear a little bit more if my speakers have more to say? Anything that we've missed yes, over there. And please obviously say who you are, where you're from.
I don't know if you can hear me. Yes. So my name is Mariel de Vescali. I work for BirdLife Europe. And actually, I am focusing my work on agriculture. And I wanted just to make a parallel here because we talked a lot about fishermen. And we can find some similarities also with farmers. And this morning, I was talking with someone from ECVC, Via Campesina, which is like the lefty small-scale farmers. And he was saying that what he's facing is that farmers are isolated. They are under heavy pressure and very isolated. And so all that we are saying here actually doesn't totally trickle down at the local level, at individual farmers. And they are also, to a certain extent, not always represented by Copa-Cogeca and the local union. So they have this impression that the only people that are taken into considering their concerns are actually the farm unions, the politicians that are giving to them simplistic speeches and views, and they don't have any trust on the NGO or people that are proposing transition. I'm just making this parallel because maybe we can also find the same situation for fishermen. And maybe what we should do is, I don't know, have like an army of people, like pilgrims, and go in and speak to individual farmers in order to address their concerns.
It is a concern. I moderate a lot in that sector, and that issue comes up, and particularly that organisation does raise it a lot. I mean, you started right at the beginning, Jutta, by saying, listen, this was a different way. I think you were saying Schleswig-Holstein, which I'm not pronouncing because I was, don't say that after gin and tonic, should you? But yes, so you said, you said actually it seemed to take longer, but in the end, it accelerated things because the result was improved and there was less blockage and less court cases. Yes, I mean, I don't know. What do fishermen do if the organisations that are meant to represent them, particularly at EU level and at national level, perhaps aren't doing their job. I mean, I don't know if you have experience of that, or that reflects any concerns that you hear about in the Netherlands, or
Well, obviously, yes. I've had a lot of experience with misrepresentation or non-representation. I mean, I cannot speak for other countries, but for the case of the Netherlands, the fishery sector is highly divided. And so they represent all types of fisheries, they represent areas based on geography, and they don't agree. So we're not talking about fisheries as one entity, it is several entities. It took us years for them to be part of the North Sea Agreement. They actually said, no, we're not part, we don't want to be part of the North Sea Agreement. And at one point in time, you know, we were actually almost starting to beg, like, please come with a representation to the table, because developments are going so fast that you will lose out if you do not join the table.
It's interesting just to say, and then I leave it open. I mean, yesterday again at Green Week, there was a panel, it was the panel on sort of biodiversity, and really nicely populated with speakers, and there was an NGO, a Dutch NGO, Common Land, and they work a lot on bringing people together to restore landscapes. And she was somebody else who was very, very keen on changing the message from we have to restore nature, and then the economic and social stuff comes alongside, rather than what does your community need, and we can achieve that through restoring nature. So there's a nuance of a difference. But she also spoke, she said that the timing, they work with all of those actors to try and find the win-win, with awareness that it isn't always there is a compromise. Mattia, you said it yourself. 20 years. I mean, they work on things for a long time in the restoration of landscapes. But one of the things she talked about is how they try and return things. And one of the returns is they try and return inspiration, belonging, unity. And that's one of the things they emphasize alongside all the other factors, be they economic or other. And again, it's this kind of much more emotional connection to, we're not better than ecosystems, we're not better than, we live with them. We cannot best them. It's impossible. They best us, actually. Anything from you, Mattia, or from you, Jutta, from what you've heard or you didn't get to say?
I find it very interesting that you say there is not one fishery sector, because at the end, by letting themselves get divided, they actually lose negotiation power. And therefore, it would be highly, for us as politicians, also for you as an industry, it would be highly appreciated if they would find common ground and have a, let's say, it shouldn't be one single person, of course, but it should be some sort of association that takes on board all the different fishery sectors and says, okay, probably our herring fishers would be fine with this, but our crab trawlers would have difficulties, so that you actually get an idea. Because Europesh is saying we're talking for the whole sector, but I don't have the impression that they're talking for the small fishers, for the ones that really have their small trawler that go out on the Baltic Sea. I don't see them very well represented by Europesh. And I have a bit of a déjà vu, because the renewable energy sector in Germany was used to be in the same fashion. We had the wind people, we had the solar power people, we had the biomass people, and each and every one was pointing with their fingers at the other renewable energy ones, instead of uniting against fossil fuels. And it took them quite a while to get their stuff together, and they finally managed to do so. But valuable time was lost, and actually, of course, the coal power business, they thought, oh great, they're fighting each other instead of fighting us. And what I also wanted to share, because I think it's so important, usually the farmers tell us, give us a break, there's so much bureaucracy, we have so much difficulties in accommodating to ever new rules, ever new instruments to get funding, and we don't want to spend our time in our offices. We want to spend our time outside. That's what we became farmers for God's sake. And I understand them very well, but I haven't met a single farmer who does not acknowledge that one of the major obstacles in having a good life, sorry, my English is leaving me right now.
Economy, salary, returns, no.
Not only economy, but also to find respect, to be respected.
Yeah.
Also part of this overall picture is the immense power that the food industry has over the lives of farmers. We had, when my kids moved out and we had space, we decided to take people in our flat, and one of these people was a young Syrian who worked in the agro-food industry. Not in the agro-food industry. He was
I'm
actually
guessing everything you're saying wrong.
I'm sorry, I'm getting too tired.
Shut up.
He was actually working for a large farmer, and he was telling us stories. I couldn't believe it. I said, today I had to drive deliveries to one of the big supermarket chains, and I had a whole truck full of salad. And the quality control person at the supermarket, he opened up the truck, he drew out some of my crates, and he said, okay, of these 100 salads I have now looked at, 2 are bad, you go back with your trucks, I will not take a single crate. Not a single crate. And that's the contracts they are forced with the supermarket, with the food industry. So what happened? What do you do with salad, a whole truck full of salad? You will not be able to sell it to anyone else because it will go bad in 2 days' time or 3. So what did they do? They dumped it on the field and they plowed it under. And that is something that is really making farmers so mad, because they say we put so much effort and work in producing good food, and there's one small thing, and then the supermarkets and the agri-food industry have the power to just delete our work, to delete also our values, sort of. And I don't see what kind of levy we would have as politicians to work against practices like that. But I'm very sure that farmers, regardless whether they're small or large, whether they come from the south of Europe or from the north, whether they farm in dairy or vegetables or grain or whatever, none of the farmers would say, oh, I'm fine with this practice.
Thank you, thank you. And just bringing it back to fishermen, fishing industry,
Yeah,
fishing sector.
Sorry, I'm sure it's the same for fishers.
No. I absolutely. I just want to get your take, because you mentioned in passing, Mattia, just coming back in to this area, this difficulty when you've got, Europesh saying, well, we don't have, this lack of stocks, and then, this suggestion here by Jutta saying, I think we need to, okay, well, let's imagine that stocks are down. What would be your take on a transition plan? You mentioned in passing, you also have conversations, that you also have, in a way, a responsibility to work with them. Any thoughts on that? Bringing them in, understanding what's at stake, understanding all of these demands, and that, the nature restoration and the nature preservation and this rollout go hand in hand.
Yeah, maybe building on what Ivat was saying before, the sector is split. Something that we also learn is artisanal fishermen and commercial fishermen. And luckily, those most affected by offshore wind are the artisanal ones. Those that, if they need to do a detour of few hundred meters, they change their business plan. And this is very important to keep in mind, because that must become really a societal duty that the wind sector has, also to help these kind of fishermen. But we also learned that they are not only split by category, they are also split by geography. Local traditions, sometimes it's not even regional, it's really local traditions and techniques. They vary a lot. So there's not one single solution to help them. And this also is something that sometimes makes us challenge maybe the way that we want to engage with them. Certain fishermen are fine to just convert their vessels and help the wind industry to do surveys or patrolling the areas during construction. Some others, no, they want to keep fishing. Some fishermen are fine to stay home and get compensation. Some fishermen, they say, no, we are hunters, we must stay at sea. So when we talk about dealing with fishermen, there's not really one solution. And yeah, I agree. For us, the engagement has been quite challenging. Europesh has not been maybe the most effective. We are now trying, and we discussed this very recently also with the NGOs, to go with the Sustainable Fishermen Association, because it's not only a way that we could help to help them, but this societal in general. All governments, they're trying to kind of transition from bottom trawling to more sustainable fishing techniques. And to do so, what we thought, for example, is really talking to fishermen, like those that ditched bottom trawling for more sustainable fishing techniques, for passive fishing, for example. How did your daily life change? How did your catches change? It's still economic effective, and if we find good examples that can be upscaled, so that maybe could give us some leverage to be more vocal in bringing around solutions.
And also critically, both in the case of the agricultural sector and the fishing and fisheries sector, I mean, the critical thing is peer-to-peer. I mean, that hasn't been mentioned, but absolutely, it's always peer-to-peer. The biggest convincers, the biggest people who can build trust is that peer-to-peer engagement. I don't want to prevail on these good people much longer, so a last thing, can you complete the sentence in no more than half a sentence before I invite our last speaker to do a nice roundup? To deliver a nature-positive energy transition, we must. Okay, aside from we must